Thank you very much for inviting me here today. Before I explore the question of whether a bee could be said to have a mind, I would like to thank my co-authors that have helped me form all the thoughts and experiments that I'm about to tell you about. And they are Catherine Wilson, Quinn Solvey, Olli Lukkola, and Peter Skorupski. So what I'd like to explore today is whether from what we know about bee spatial cognition, we can make inferences about the question of whether bees or other insects are conscious. So what I mean by that is that there is some form of mental representation of things, of space, and of things in space. I also want to explore whether bees in the context of spatial cognition have an appreciation of the outcomes of their own actions and their spatial problem-solving tasks, and whether there might be emotional states that are linked to spatial settings. So there is a common perception that while people realize that insects can do very complex things, that they do them by means wholly different from how humans solve them. So here is something that at first glance maybe shows a similar outcome, the famous La Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona, and a large termite construction roughly of a similar shape. And the common perception is that in the human architecture case, there is a master plan, a plan for how the ultimate outcome should look, and then all the other actions are subordinate to that plan, whereas in insects, everything arises by local interactions where no one has any idea of what the ultimate product should look like. And I will hopefully show you some examples that at least this dichotomy between these two different paths isn't quite so clear-cut as you might think. The discussion is quite old, it's not novel. So here's Charles Bonnet, a Swiss naturalist who lived from 1720 to 1793. And Charles Bonnet had the following to say about self-organization in the bee colony, and the possibility of how one might construct something as marvelous as the hexagonal structure of a honeycomb shown here on the bottom left. He said this: "Place together in the same room 10,000 automatons animated with a living force, and all induced through the perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being. If we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well-proportioned, similar, equal, but it will also have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection." So it's interesting here that Bonnet sees the idea of there being a consciousness and feelings sort of as something primitive, as something given, but he still calls them automatons and thinks that somehow by just putting all of these conscious automatons together in the same room, something as magnificent as this honeycomb structure might arise just naturally. Now, I do not think that it's quite so simple. Of course, there have been quite a few crude human experiments in stuffing 10,000 animals together in the same room, as you can see in this chicken battery farm. And for some reason, something as regularly structured as a honeycomb or any form of architecture clearly does not emerge just by itself. So you need a little more than just stuffing lots of animals, perhaps conscious animals, together in the same room to arrive at any form of animal architecture. So many people have mused that there is something remarkable about this extremely regular construction of the honeycomb. You can see a honeycomb under construction here. There are dozens or hundreds of individuals of bees participating in this process. It's a mathematically perfect solution for honey storage, for brood storage, in terms of minimizing materials and space used and so on. It's also double-sided, so on both sides you can store larvae and honey and so on. And typically the structure is started at the ceiling of the hive, and then gradually the bees work their way down until they've reached the bottom. But another Swiss naturalist, François Hubert, explored the inner workings of the hive centuries ago and made some very surprising discoveries. So he experimented with glass hives to see what the bees might do inside the hive while they're constructing their beautifully regular honeycombs. And what he found was the first thing, that if he introduced a glass ceiling into the hive, is that the bees didn't particularly like attaching wax comb to glass. So surprisingly, that didn't perturb them much, because they simply then inverted the entire construction process 180 degrees. Instead of working their way downward from the ceiling, they built the whole comb as a tower construction, starting at the bottom and then gradually working their way up until they'd reached the ceiling. Now, it's still a very repetitive process, but if you'd programmed a robot to do exactly the same as the honeybee does, working down along gravity, that robot would already fail at this particular challenge unless you told the robot to be able to invert their procedure in its alignment with gravity. But the next experiment was even more surprising. So Hubert, when he discovered this flexibility in bees, then introduced a glass bottom in addition to a glass ceiling. And what he found in that case is that the bees would start on the side wall of the hive and extend the comb construction laterally through the cavity that he had provided the bees with. What Hubert did next was the really surprising result. While the construction was in process, so the bees had been built halfway through the cavity, he then put a glass obstacle in the projected path of the growing honeycomb. Okay, so the bees had already built their two-dimensional construction almost or halfway through that cavity, and then suddenly there was an obstacle that the bees would have perceived, perhaps if they explored further in the linear direction of the growing honeycomb, found that it must have been suboptimal, because what happened was that the bees then, before actually reaching the suboptimal surface, would build a 90-degree kink into the comb and attach it to the nearest sidewall. So they avoided projecting from the geometry of the current construction that there might be a suboptimal outcome several days down the line. It takes a long while to build honeycomb. They projected and anticipated, or seemed to have anticipated, this suboptimal outcome and took corrective action before it materialized, and built this strange curved construction. And Hubert, 200 years ago, said, "I acknowledge that I could not suppress a sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed." So these experiments await replication with modern acceptable sample sizes, but they're nonetheless very interesting, in part because they were not actually designed to explore foresight. It was a surprise discovery, and that is, I think, very informative. So Hubert thought that bees have a kind of master plan, an idea of what the desirable outcome of their comb construction might be like. So the way we nowadays study bee orientation, we have a tool called harmonic radar, which is the equipment that you can see rotating here on the right, which contains a dish that sends a signal, which in turn is sent to a bee, and with this so-called transponder, the bee bounces it back so the top dish can pick it up, and in that way informs us about its location. And in that way, we can monitor bees' orientation from their maiden flight, the first time they ever leave the hive, to their death, essentially, and monitor where they've been all their lives. And just to make you appreciate the general challenge, of course, human-made environments in general, compared to natural environments, are relatively easy to navigate. And that's because we build landmarks, buildings that are meant to be unique and memorable. If, on the other hand, you consider a typical bees environment, so here's a typical bees environment, then what you see that everything looks a bit the same. So a typical bees challenge might be that there is a nesting site somewhere under this particular tree, and several kilometers away there might be a location over here where there's good pollen to be had, and another location over there behind that hill where there might be particularly good nectar. And so there's a lot more similarity between perhaps familiar landmarks than there is in any kind of city. So if you've ever navigated an environment like this without a map or without sat-navs or without help from others, then you can sort of appreciate the challenge that navigating insects face in natural environments. And so what we can do with our fancy radar equipment is we can essentially take the view from the cockpit of a bee and see how she sees the world as she's navigating around her environment. So this is actually a reconstructed bee view from one of our radar tracks. You can see here the slightly boomerang-shaped eyes of the bee and the view through them. So the view is relatively coarse pixeled, and a bee sees a lot fewer pixels, so to speak, than a human does, but on the other end, she can see more rapidly. And the reason why these images are very distorted is because bees have pretty much all-round vision. And so through these kinds of simulations, we can know exactly what kind of landmarks are of interest for a bee as she flies around her environment. And using this kind of tool, we can see how bees solve the kind of problem of memorizing multiple different locations, keeping all of them in mind, not only that, but also finding a most efficient route between these locations, which resembles a traveling salesman problem insofar as the bee actually has to find the shortest route as well as the one that minimizes energy expenditure and time expenditure. And in that sense, it's similar to a traveling salesman who has to link perhaps 5 cities while minimizing his petrol expenditure. So here are 5 locations, each marked with a blue dot, and down here is the hive of the bee. And you can see a single track of a bee here. This is not a particularly efficient solution because the bee is only just beginning to explore this task. As bees get more experienced, you can see a single bee's developing tracks here. We're now in its second bout, and it's discovered the 4 of the 5 locations. Now it's discovered the 5th one. And over time, the bee at the moment still explores quite a bit and tries out different solutions. But as we're now in bout number 20, you can see that the solutions get extremely streamlined, and she, in the end, focuses on just the most efficient route to link these 5 locations to their hive location. So she indeed solved the traveling salesman problem in this particular case. What we can also do in this case is we let the bees to their own devices and do not pose them any particular challenges with artificial feeding stations. Instead, we let them roam freely. We let them explore their environment as they see fit and discover flower resources to forage from. So what we see here in green is one individual's maiden flight, the first flight that she's ever made in her life. And you can see that there are various loops in various directions from the hive location, which is marked here in blue. In red, by the way, it's the second bee's exploration flight. And she flies in various directions. There's a big loop here, and there's another loop there, another loop there. So she flies in a variety of directions from the hive, exploring her environment, both to memorize the landscape, as well as perhaps to discover the first few flower patches that might be useful for harvesting nectar. Also of importance, we'll later realize why, is that during this first exploration flight, she flies to this forest edge here once, and we'll come back to the significance of that later. So that's the bee's first day, 2 flights. One of them lasted about 2 hours, the second one much shorter. Now this is what the bee does from day 2. She makes one more exploratory flight in this direction. There's a single loop here. And then she's discovered a flower patch by the forest edge up here. And then for several days, for up to over the 82nd bout, basically, over several days, she only visits that one location and exploits the flowers there and shuttles back and forth between the hive and this particular foraging location. Nothing but, she doesn't visit anything else. This is a complete record of what that bee does. Then there were a few days of inclement weather when the bee stayed at home, and after that, on day 11, she departed again, visited the familiar patch from which she'd spent the last few days foraging one more time, then flew back to the hive, flew out to that patch again, and then suddenly changed her mind, it seems, and instead of flying to that recently exploited patch, turns her attention entirely to a patch that she'd only visited on her very first foraging flight 10 days earlier, and then spends the rest of her days just visiting that patch. But the most interesting observation here, in a sense to me, is the sudden change of mind on a foraging bout to the patch first exploited, and then halfway through a foraging flight, she switches over and retrieves from a distant memory the location of another patch that she just visited once during her early explorations, and then stuck with that until during one flight she just disappeared off the radar, presumably having been eaten by a bird or a crab spider. When I talked to colleagues who work on cognition in primates and corvid birds, they were always a bit dismissive of bees' learning abilities. I told them about how bees can learn colors of flowers and scents and so on. And they said, well, that's what bees do every day in visiting flowers. It's not any evidence for intelligence. And so they were at the time working on things like string pulling tasks in corvid birds, for example. And at some point, just to be provocative in a lab meeting, I said, well, I bet our bees can solve such a string pulling puzzle, and no one quite believed it. But I had a few bold postdocs in my lab who were willing to give it a go. And so what you can see in this slide is a task, is a string pulling task in which there are 3 artificial flowers, each connected to a string and with a central nectar well that a bee would have to get to in order to obtain a reward. And what you can see in this video is the first bee that we ever trained to solve such a task. Here she is landing, and now she's found a string and she's pulling it out. She's not landing on the top of the flower. She clearly is not necessarily efficient at it, but she knows what she's doing in that she has to pull that string and remove it from under the glass table to get an access to a reward. Not only can bees learn to pull strings by us gradually telling them, they can also learn it by observing each other. So in this video here, we have 2 bees, one marked with a red dot, and that's an experienced individual that has done it before, and a completely naive bee who has no idea what she's doing. And you can see that the experienced individual with the red dot pulls out the flower, and then they both imbibe the sugar solution together. And then the inexperienced bee simply scrounges on the abilities of the experienced demonstrator. And then after a while, you can see now they're getting a bit nervous because actually the flower, the nectar droplet has been depleted, there's nothing in, and the red marked experienced bee just runs over to the next flower and pulls it out. This one still tries, there must be something more here. Let me see if I can find it. Now she's running over, scrounging again on the experienced bees' efforts, and this will continue until they've pulled all the 4 of them out. But if you repeat this process multiple times, then the observer bees will actually learn to pick up the technique and solve it by themselves. Not only that, here the bees, of course, interact directly with one another, but you can even lock up the observer bee in a little glass cage, so to speak, and just let it view the trained demonstrator from a distance. And even from such distant observations can the observers learn the correct technique to pull a string. So in the next slide, we can see one dot for each individual bee. So at the top there is number 31, that's the first demonstrator bee. And in this video, we can see how the technique of string pulling spreads through an entire colony. So you can see there are little lines appearing now. Each of these lines marks one interaction, one pairwise interaction between a trained demonstrator and an observer bee. Moreover, you can see now some of the other dots are turning colored, and they turn colored when the interaction has resulted in the demonstrator being able to solve the task by herself. And so now there's a good number of bees that have all been trained by yellow 31 at the top there, and all the ones that have turned orange actually can do it by themselves. And as this goes on, there are now interactions between bees who are not the generation 1 learner. So here now is a purple bee, that color marks that this bee has not learned the technique from the original trained demonstrator, but a second generation bee. And as this process continues, more and more bees, here's another purple bee now, learn the technique from second generation demonstrators. And in fact, as the process continues and gradually all bees learn the technique, ultimately even the original demonstrator passes away and the technique continues spreading through the colony. So there is in the end a whole colony of string pulling foragers. So there is a kind of cultural spread of this string pulling technique through an entire bee colony. For the next experiment, I will let Jane Goodall do the introduction.
The most recent example which blows people's minds is the bumblebee. And the bumblebee has been taught to roll a little ball. He rolls it backwards. He rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as this little ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So they learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is other bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I'd love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
So the task, as Jane Goodall just explained, is to move the ball, in this case from the periphery to the center of this horizontal area. And once the ball arrives in the center, the bee gets a sugar reward. So they can be trained to do that just fine. But the reason why the social learning by observation in this task is so particularly remarkable is this. So what we can see in this slide is a task with 2 bumblebees. Here is an experienced bee that has already solved the task before. That's our so-called demonstrator. And then there's an observer, which has never solved that task before, so she's entirely naive. And when the 2 bees get together, this is what happens. if you, so you can see here the experienced bee rolling the ball to the center, and then they both get a little sugar droplet as a reward. Now, obviously, the logical way to solve this task, if all you need to do is to get a ball into the center, would be to pick the closest ball that's closest to the target area and move that to the center. But we've played a little trick. The experienced bee, the one that you've just seen roll the ball into the center, actually knows that the two closest balls, this one and that one, cannot be moved because they're glued down. So that bee knows I have to pick the furthest ball, so the least optimal one, to move to the target area. And so for 3 times, the naive observer gets to see that. It gets to see the demonstrator bee use the furthest ball, moving it into the central target area. So what we see in this slide now is the observer being alone. This observer has seen the demonstrator solve the task 3 times, and every time the demonstrator used the furthest ball. Now the observer is on her own. Will she pick the same furthest ball, or will she solve the task in a better way and pick the closest ball? And she picks the closest ball. So she's not simply copying the demonstrator exactly. She actually seems to have a form of understanding of what is the desired outcome of her actions. And rather than simply aping the demonstrator, she picks the optimal ball to solve the task. Okay, so our next question is, can bees picture things? Can they imagine things such as a flower's shape and so on? Now, bees are, of course, famously good at recognizing flower patterns, but it's actually surprisingly difficult to find out whether there is such a thing as a mental representation of a flower, even if an insect recognizes it, because often it turns out that flower patterns can be recognized with simple feature detectors that analyze edge orientation and so on. So in our following experiment, we asked if bees can actually draw on a representation of a particular shape through multiple different sensory modalities, which would be more of an indication of a mental representation of shape than just recognizing a shape in the visual modality. So what we did initially is we trained the bees to distinguish 2 different shapes, balls and cubes, but in this case they could not touch them. They could only see them through a plexiglass lid, and one of the shapes, in this case the ball, was associated with reward. That means a little reward of sugar solution, and the other, in this case the cubes, was not. And then the same bees that were trained in this manner were now presented with the same shapes in complete darkness, where they couldn't see at all, but in this case they were allowed to touch these different shapes. And in this case, when the bees had first been trained to see and be rewarded over balls that, however, they could not touch in the light, then if the same bees were tested in complete darkness, then they chose the balls over the cubes only using the touch modality. So they could recognize the same object in a different sensory modality. And we then also reversed this experiment, where we first exposed the bees to the same shapes in complete darkness, as shown in this photograph here. We used infrared light, of course, to monitor the bee's behavior. And you can see that the bee here is sort of hugging the ball while she's imbibing the sugar solution reward. The cube, in this case, was unrewarding. And then in the same manner, we switched the situation to one in which they could no longer rely on the touch modality, but on vision. However, again, in this particular experiment, the bees could not touch the shapes as they had during training, but only see them. And sure enough, the bee, again, after being trained to the round shape in darkness, when she faced the same shapes in the light picked the balls over the cubes. So in both of these scenarios, they picked the correct object in a different sensory modality, from which we conclude from this kind of flexible axis through different sensory modality that indeed there must be a kind of mental representation of the shape of an object. Do insects have emotions? Charles Turner did at least take this possibility seriously. I invite you all to read the papers of this man. He lived from 1867 to 1923. He was an entomologist as well as a psychologist, and his literature is extremely rich with visionary ideas that unfortunately have been largely forgotten today. But it's remarkable also that he actually did consider the possibility of these digger wasps having emotions. So this is a photograph by him from one of his papers in 1912, and he writes this: "The coiled antenna, the protruding mouth parts, and the general attitude indicate intense excitement. One who believes that insects have emotions will find much in the attitude of these two Ammophilas to support his view." Now, Turner was aware that this was merely an observation. It was not an experimental exploration. He has very rigorous experiments in many of his other papers, which I would strongly encourage you to read. But how might one test emotions in insects experimentally and quantitatively? Well, we chose to use a paradigm that is simply borrowed from vertebrate research. It is basically asking whether an animal's or an individual's glass is half full or half empty, as symbolized in this little photograph here. So an optimist would judge this ambiguous situation as being glass half full, and the pessimist, faced with exactly the same situation, would say it is half empty. And so you can actually test animals' emotional states by asking them the same kind of question in ambiguous situations. And that sort of task that I'm just going to explain is used exactly in the same kind of manner in domestic animals, for example, to find out whether they're happy domestic animals or unhappy ones. So what did we do? We have a little flight arena, as you can see there on top. And the bee has 5 options, either to pick the leftmost option marked in purple, or the right marked in green. And there's only ever one option available, so it's a so-called go, no-go task. And what the animal learns over time is that whenever the blue left option is available, there is a reward. Whenever the green right option is available, there is no reward. And after this training, the bee is then faced with various intermediate ambiguous options, such as turquoise or greenish turquoise or bluish turquoise. And we're then asking, well, do you judge this more likely as being a positive outcome? Might the glass be half full, or a negative one? Is it unrewarding in this case? So here's the training in simple forms, what the bee does when she's learned that the blue left option is rewarding. She flies there in a straight line. If, on the other hand, the green option is presented, the bee already knows, well, this isn't any good. She faffs about for a great deal of time, and then finally says, well, okay, I might as well go and try it. But she takes a much longer delay time before accepting an option that she already knows as being unrewarding. The question then is, what happens with the ambiguous intermediate option? So here is a turquoise one. And again, when we present the bee with the turquoise option, we then measure the delay time that it takes her to accept that option. And interestingly, that delay time depends on something that happened before this experiment. It depends on whether we gave the bee a little sucrose droplet as a surprise. So here she gets 5 microliters of a surprise droplet of sucrose in the run-up to the experiment before she even enters the arena. And in the control group, she gets nothing. And it turns out that the way the bee judges this ambiguous situation turquoise, depends on what happened before she even started the experiment. And that's shown in this graph on the right side here. So when the bees face their familiar rewarding option, that's P on the right, the delay time is invariably very short. They fly straight there. If, on the other hand, the green right option is shown, that's shown on the right here, invariably the bees will delay for quite some time before accepting that option. But for all the ambiguous options, so turquoise being in the middle, there is a difference depending on what happened before the experiment. So if the bees, before starting the experiment, had their little surprise reward, ooh, there's a sweet that I've never seen here before, they tend to accept the ambiguous option faster, that's our red line here, than they would otherwise. So if there was a surprise reward before the experiment, the bees accept the intermediate option more rapidly. So they behave in this glass half full, glass half empty, in this ambiguous situation more optimistically if they've had a surprise reward before entering the experiment. And you can do, of course, the same with adverse stimuli, in which case the bee will behave in the opposite way. So there is, by the same criteria by which we judge mammals, domestic animals, as being emotionally biased in either a positive or a negative direction, by the same criteria, bees could be judged to have simple emotional states. Now, a final question might be whether insect brains aren't just too small to contain anything such as a mind. Aren't they just too simple, too undifferentiated? And undoubtedly, bee brains are extremely small, the size of a bee head. And of course, the brain is substantially smaller than that, roughly 1 cubic millimeter. And indeed, they contain relatively few neurons, certainly compared to the 80 billion that a human might have. So roughly 850,000 neurons in a bee's brain. Here's a portrait of a frontal view of a bee's brain. So even though insect brains are small and the number of neurons are few, they are by no means simple. So here's the structure of a single neuron in a bee's brain. And you can see that it's about as finely branched as a fully grown oak tree. Extremely wide ramifications through all regions of the brain, including the antennal lobes and the mushroom bodies and so on. That is just a single neuron. And it turns out that this neuron largely constitutes the reward pathway in the bee's brain. So each single such neuron might make connections with perhaps 10,000 other neurons. And from that, you can deduce that there is an extremely finely grained and detailed neural network across the bee brain. If you ask computer scientists how many neurons you need for consciousness-like phenomena, such as predicting outcomes of one's own actions, then it's diminutively small, perhaps 10,000, compared to even a bee's brain.
There is at least some suggestive evidence to indicate that insect brains might support consciousness. One comes from the neurobiology of a central complex, whose most important and well described role is in navigation, but it also integrates information from external stimuli, internal states such as motivation, and past experiences, and could thus represent a kind of neural model of the familiar space around the insect as well as of the self, as, for example, suggested by Barron and Klein in a 2016 PNAS paper. In the same vein, some jewel wasps, parasitoid insects, sting cockroaches into the vicinity of the central complex. And this has the effect of turning them into something like behavioral zombies that have still got reflexes and they can still walk, but they lack any form of self-initiated action as might be generated by a will, for example. Interestingly also, Bruno van Swinderen's team has shown that analogous to vertebrates, insects have several types of brainwaves that correlate with the state of wakefulness or sleep. Several sleep phases are also well described by such brainwaves. And crucially, more synchronized brainwaves across brain areas occur in awake states, perhaps facilitating the kind of cross-modal cognition that we've heard about earlier. And finally, there are neural correlates of attention. Attention is a form of inner eye focusing selectively on certain stimuli, but not others. And these investigations also showed brain states that precede the bee's selection of one or another stimulus. That's also work from Bruno van Swinderen's lab.
So insect brains are not simple, and I think not too simple to contain a mind. So finally, some conclusions. We have seen from our experimental work and that of others that bees appear to have some sort of representations of space and time, that they can learn by observation, that indeed they can display a simple form of tool use in a manner that indicates an intentionality or a form of understanding the outcome of their actions. It appears from our work, bees have access to a kind of memory library and an idea of what they want and how to get there, and to explore in their minds possible solutions to the desirable outcomes. Now, some of you might counter, or a philosopher might counter, that none of this is actually formal evidence for consciousness, and they would be right. All of these abilities, one by one, could be replicated in software or in hardware implementations, a robot. But I think in their sum, all of these abilities nudge the probabilities increasingly in the direction of a conscious agent. There is a crucial difference in that while you could build a robot that can deliver all of these different performances, if you had built one 10 years ago mimicking everything a bee was known to display, then perhaps color learning and scent learning and place learning, that robot would fall flat on its face with novel tasks such as string pulling and ball rolling and learning by observation and so on. So you can build a robot to do something that you ask it to do. Good, you're a good programmer. But not easily to solve problems that it's never been encountering before. And that is what bees seem to be doing over and over again. And I assume that in the coming years, we'll find yet more cognitive performances that bees can do, but a robot programmed to do what we've known bees to do in the past will fail with these novel challenges. Finally, some broader conclusions. I think it's ready to open up a window into the possibility, at least, of a very rich inner world in insects, that there are mental explorations of solutions to possible problems, and that there are sorts of emotional states, at least by the same criteria as we diagnose them in large brain mammals, that there are emotional states that we can diagnose, and that we should perhaps explore whether there are even emotions that we don't know in other animals, such as that might be linked to unique bee minds, unique bee problems, such as the discovery of a nectar-rich flower or the swarming process when honeybees move from one hive to the next. And finally, I think it's important to consider the ethical implications of such research, the possibility that there is a mind, possibly suffering in bees, and I think that is important for how we consider their conservation, as well as thinking about how we treat animals in research laboratories. Thank you very much for your attention.